here today, covering a wide range of different themes from Hill's book. We were due to start with Jackie Eales, who is Emerita Professor of History at Canterbury Christchurch University. Many of you will know her work, of course, on the Grantham Bryan and the outbreak of the English Civil War. More recently, in the last couple of decades, she's produced a very large number of outputs on various aspects of women's lives in early modern England, a short textbook, and also most recently has been working on various aspects of clerical marriage in the 17th century, a very underexplored topic. Unfortunately, Jackie's not able to be here today, but Penny has very kindly stepped into the breach. Many of you will know Penny Corfield, who's Emeritus Professor of History at Royal Holloway, currently affiliated to Newcastle University, working on various projects up there on 18th century politics. Very strong research interests in 17th and 18th century urban history, history of class, and also historiography. Penny's going to present Jackie's paper, which is entitled James Hunt and the World Turned Upside Down, Christopher Hill's Missing Prophet. Over to you, Penny.
Everyone, I'm wearing two hats, and at the moment my hat says I'm Jackie Eales. And I'm very apologetic for not being here in person, but here are my words. From time to time, Penny Corfield may add a few things, but you will be able to detect when I say I, it is I, Jackie, who's speaking. Any interjection will be from Corfield, who was, incidentally, Jackie's doctoral supervisor, and now a close friend. So I, Jackie, was very excited when Waseem asked me to contribute today, as I first read The World Turned Upside Down in my first term as an undergraduate at Bedford College in 1972, when Conrad Russell set an essay on whether the 1640s and 50s were indeed the world turned upside down. And Penny Corfield interjects, Christopher would be quite amused at Conrad Russell setting such a topic, because the two of them never saw eye to eye, although they always spoke most respectfully of each other and debated respectfully. But Christopher would be secretly rather thrilled to hear that Conrad's heard that the world might have been turned upside down in the 1640s. But now, I'm Jackie. The book had just been published, and it didn't just knock my socks off, it blew them over the hills and far away. After consuming a diet of worthy monographs on the Reformation and Elizabethan Puritanism during the previous 6 weeks, I now thought, wow, this is what you can do with intellectual history. I'm sure there will be critiques of Christopher's book today, but bear in mind that when it was published, there was very little that compared to it. It is elegantly written, eloquently argued, and it provided an authoritative overview of the origins of the levellers, the diggers, the ranters, seekers, Quakers, and others. And above all, Christopher was the master of the telling quote. He always finds the lapidary sentence, the concise phrase, the clear arguments contained in the primary sources. And as this audience will appreciate, that is not always an easy task when dealing with mid-17th century English prose. For today, I decided to respond to what Christopher had to say about Kent's very own prophet. No, not Ludovic Muggleton, but the rather more obscure James Hunt, a yeoman of Sevenoaks. Hunt started his career as a self-proclaimed prophet and lay preacher in London in the late 1630s. In 1640 and 41, he preached at various London churches, as well as the Church of St Paul's, the Exchange, and Westminster Hall, and he was committed to the Bridewell in 1640 on the orders of the court for his absurd preaching. Between December 1641 and 1648, Hunt published 12 tracts and was repeatedly imprisoned. The last mention of him comes from 1653, when he was imprisoned in the gatehouse at Westminster. The only problem was that the elusive James Hunt is not mentioned in The World Turned Upside Down, although he was there in spirit, because my first edition of the book, with the woodcut of the Tub Thumper on the front cover, is based on the title page of Hunt's first publication. I meant to bring my copy and hold it up, but anyway, it's a classic woodcut of the Tub Thumper. I'm sure you all have seen it. That was based on a publication from Hunt. So why did I, that's Jackie, think that Hunt should be in the book, and why isn't he? Given his career, I thought he might make an appearance in Chapter 6, A Nation of Prophets, or Chapter 13, The Island's Great Bedlam. Hunt is initially derided as a prophet in print by John Taylor in 1641, and by the mid-1640s, Hunt had embraced the title. In his tracts, he claimed to be inspired to preach by the light within. He repudiated the commands of the Old Testament in favour of the New Testament, and he declared true love and peace to be the greatest commandment. He demanded that the sign of the cross at baptism and godparents should be discontinued, and attacked anyone who tried to stop him preaching, starting with the bishops. He was particularly scathing about the clergy, the black coats as he termed them, and their monopoly of book learning. He depicted them as the second beast from the book of Revelation, using their dark arts of scholarship. In 1643, he disrupted William Turner's sermons in Sevenoaks, and in 1647, interrupted the prayers of a curate, Richard Kentish. In one track, Hunt endorses female preachers and describes God as both father and mother of the spirits, but he did not pursue these thoughts any further. So, why did Hill not include Hunt in The World Turned Upside Down? I think that by considering this, we can see more of what Hill was doing in the book. Hill described his book as a study of the left wing of radical Puritanism. We could take issue with any or all of those labels, which may sound dated today, but which made sense when the book was published. But the book is also concerned with influences, connections, legacies, and debates between the Civil War sects and political parties, and this is where Hunt falls short. Unlike Ludovic Muggleton, Hunt does not seem to have had any followers, and he did not align himself with any group. It's also not clear who read his tracts. He doesn't appear in Thomas Edward's Gangrena, although he is lampooned in by a few other writers such as John Taylor. And finally, Hunt's ideas about settling the church and state are ultimately rather tame for the times. Hunt envisaged the survival of a national church with ministers, but not university-educated ones. He argued for peace, love, and the English language would bring all nations to one religious truth. Like many others, he was increasingly disillusioned with Parliament, and in 1648 demanded that Charles I be allowed to go to Knowle, in Kent of course, the seat of the county committee, where he could call a new parliament and settle peace. And the last we hear of him is in prison in 1653, where Hunt was sent down, quote, for his strange prophecies of the Stuarts coming again to the crown, and he was sent of God to persuade old Cromwell to resign his new assumed authority of protectorship. So a bit of a trajectory. So Hunt was not an influencer, and he didn't make the cut in The World Turned Upside Down. But his career as a prophet does illustrate the intoxicating excitement, as Christopher Hill termed it, of being able to express revolutionary beliefs in the print and speech of the 1640s. I'm still of course, Jackie, I can vouch that in 1972, Hill's book was similarly intoxicating and exciting in its impact on its first readers.
Thank you very much, both Jackie and Penny. Very good start to proceedings. Right, we'll move swiftly on. Our next speaker is Ed Legon from Queen Mary University of London, where he's a senior lecturer in heritage management and business history. Ed is also Programme Director of the Heritage Management MA in collaboration with Historic Royal Palaces, but still seems to have found a large amount of time to churn out a very impressive range of publications. Many of you will be aware of his first monograph, which came out a couple of years ago, based on his doctoral thesis, Remembering Revolutions, Seditious Memories After the British Civil Wars, very important contribution to developing the field, looking at the impact rather than the origins of the conflict. And he's also published a very wide range of articles, most recently in the English Historical Review. Ed's currently working on a new book on the history of production and trade, specifically looking at the political culture of 17th century textile workers, which we apparently will be hearing about more today. So over to you, Ed.
Indeed, Tim, for that kind introduction. I also want to express my great thanks to Waseem and John, who have put a huge amount of effort and energy into organising today, and I'm very much looking forward to it, so thanks very much indeed. So in June 1645, the Royalist news organ, Mercurius Orlicus, reported Parliament's abortive siege of Oxford earlier that month. Among the so-called rebels taken prisoner was, quote, their lieutenant, a preaching silk weaver. Orlicus queried, will that trade never leave preaching? Sure, the weavers take themselves to be the tribe of Levi. This brief, scornful aside tapped into one of the most effective motifs of royalist propaganda in the 1640s and 50s. That Parliament's preachers were drawn from inferior social ranks. These were people who had no business meddling in the political and religious affairs of the kingdoms. Such claims often resounded with the occupational labels of those who had preached without licence and even usurped the pulpits of ordained ministers. So it was that in 1648 one critic mourned a society from which, quote, all order and discipline is taken away, the ministers of God are murdered and silenced, and mechanic scums, viz., tailors, weavers, and mop-makers, take upon them the sacred function of the ministry and infect the people with nonsense, blasphemy, and treason. This kind of abuse was common in orthodox critiques of separatism amid the civil wars, as Parliament's diverse support base disapparated. One of the chief critics was the heresiographer Thomas Edwards, whose Gangrena spoke, quote, of mechanics taking upon them to preach and baptize, as smiths, tailors, shoemakers, pedlars, weavers, etc., amid all confusion and disorder in church matters. Another much later detractor was John Walker, whose famous account of the sufferings of the Anglican clergy during the 1640s and 50s impugned those who, quote, claimed an inheritance among the tribe of Levi again, but were the lowest of the people and of the most contemptible mechanic occupations, but had never been so much as made priests. As Walker's sufferings makes clear, such attacks survived the Restoration era, informing the conformist invective of Royalists and Tories. We must be cautious if we are to seek truth behind such ad hominem. The stereotype of the preaching weaver was, as we will see, an efficacious form of censure, a commonly conceived paradox which served to reinforce the strict hierarchy of the church, particularly after the Restoration. But it is also the case that the nigh-frenzied rhetoric of Presbyterians, Royalists, and Tories relied upon a kernel of truth, or perhaps kernels, to which people had borne witness in the 1640s and 50s. In Anne Hughes' words, quote, in their own time, categories and stereotypes have to have some plausibility, some recognisable connection to how individuals behave if they are to have any polemical effect. During the Revolution, this behaviour comprised new, emboldened forms of political and religious participation, which transgressed hegemonic ideas about the social order, what Francis Bremer has termed lay empowerment. Drawing on research for a book about 17th century clothmakers and their politics, I want to highlight some of the empowered mechanic preachers of England and Wales. Whereas much of the information about lay evangelism derives from precisely those who sought to benefit from its exaggeration, including but not limited to Edwards and Walker, additional evidence illuminates examples of textile workers who took it upon themselves to preach in the 1640s and into the 50s. Here, of course, I'm inspired by The World Turned Upside Down, in which Hill took seriously the lives and ideas of plebeian actors who were ushered forth onto the political and religious stage at this time. What he called, quote, the staggering eloquence, the power of the simple artisans. Moreover, as Hill showed, the radicalism of these individuals cannot, and for contemporaries could not, be extricated from their labour, and with it, the precarious material conditions of rapid capitalist transformation within which such labour took place. So, who were the textile worker preachers of the English Revolution? Some are so obscure that we know of them only by name. Take, for instance, one, Dingle, described laconically by John Walker in his Sufferings of the Clergy as, quote, a weaver, but one of the better sort, a cloth weaver, who preached at St Allan, Cornwall, on the sequestration of James Rosington. Walker also recorded two cloth makers who propagated the gospel in Wales in the 1650s, Benjamin Richards, a weaver and itinerant preacher, and the Swansea-born James Jones, likewise a weaver, who preached in Glamorganshire. Occasionally, Walker offers a little bit more detail. Remaining in Wales, he cited the intrusion of Walter, the weaver, into the pulpit of Llandaff, Glamorganshire, where he, quote, ran down the decent ceremonies of the church and put up, as well as he could, a slovenly outward worship, beginning in Genesis and ending in the Revelations. Meanwhile, one Tucker, another, quote, affirmed weaver, had apparently joined Parliament's army, become a preacher, and usurped the pulpit at Bobby Tracy in Devon, where he preached with a sword by his side, defaced miserably the church of Bobby, tore down not only the king's arms, but the very commandments, and with his own hands laboured to saw the font in pieces. Little evidence enables us to corroborate John Walker's accounts, and I've tried. And it invites doubt about whether details of mechanic preachers were half remembered or invented to tap into commonplace prejudice against such men. His description of Tucker's preaching with a sword by his side, a trope which made it into royalist print after the Restoration, could inspire distrust. As Fiona McCall has shown, Walker's Sufferings of Church of England Ministers was collated 7 decades after the events in question, and often drew on oral tradition rather than documentary evidence. We know that other preachers who were accused of forsaking the loom for the pulpit, or preaching tub, existed, but our efforts to corroborate their former or continuing involvement in the cloth industry proved fruitless. John Price's public defence of the Welsh preacher Hugh Evans from the censures of John Moon provides the sole evidence that he was, quote, bound apprentice in the city of Worcester to a clothier, and there he learned the trade and wrought there many years. Another of Walker's cast of Welsh weavers, Harry Elias, may well be the son whose ministry is mentioned in the 1659 will of Ellis ap Parry. It is unclear which of these men, if not another, was the, quote, blessed understanding man, a weaver by trade, who was apparently preaching in Wales before 1653. Across the English border, one more was certainly settled at Exhall near Ulster after the ejection of John Ryland, but we do not know whether, as John Walker claimed, he was a comber of wool. Lemuel Chuk, who allegedly preached regicide in Essex during the 1640s, was cited by his predecessor at Rain as, quote, by education a weaver of no university, yet one that hath charge of souls in Nottinghamshire. Chuk's cure in Nottinghamshire is certain, but there is no evidence that he was a weaver. Elsewhere, Master Worley, whom Mercurius Orlicus named as a weaver-turned-preacher in Hertfordshire, was Thomas Worley, who Keith Lindley has tracked from his origins in Whitechapel. While Whitechapel was a centre of the cloth trade, this is no smoking gun. Elsewhere, the notoriety of some preachers' apparently humble backgrounds casts the lack of corroborating evidence into even starker relief. There is no trace of Henry Oakes, a weaver preacher, who was named as a party in the infamous, exclusively artisanal disputation at Henley and Arden, Warwickshire in 1651. On the other side of the West Midlands, Staffordshire's Baptist minister Henry Haggard underwent a searing and very public rebuke at the hands of Orthodox counterpart Elmer Houghton, including 2 pointed references to Haggard's origins as a shearman of cloth. Even more colourful details of cloth makers and indeed sellers' experiences of evangelism make difficulties of substantiation particularly frustrating. Thomas Sadler, a former linen draper of St Albans or thereabouts, was a source of royalist mirth in 1643 when he allegedly fell through the tub from which he was preaching, owing to his, quote, violent expressions and agility of action in stamping the word damnation. Elsewhere, public knowledge of preachers' origins in the cloth industry resulted in apparently innovative forms of popular protest. Giles Say, vicar of Catherington in Hampshire, was presented with a weaver's shuttle by his parishioners, an allusion to his former trade. John Walker, who recorded Say's humiliation, also described the ridicule of Edward Dow, the successor of Edward Cherry at Great Holland in East Essex, quote, who was confidently reported to have been a weaver. While Dow allegedly pulled down the font, one local wag observed that, quote, it would make a rare thing for him to wind quills in. I infer that Dow was using a rope to pull down the font, thus resembling the process of quilling or winding yarn to a quill, an activity which Dow forewent for the ministry. So, these snippets stimulate interest perhaps, but their provenance is difficult to assess. Even so, as Fiona McCall has argued in her work on John Walker's sufferings, we should avoid dismissal of his use of oral tradition when these were based on events of what she calls emotional significance to the ejected clergy and their friends and families. Advisedly, Anne Hughes accepts the overall veracity of episodes which informed Thomas Edwards Gangrena, while retaining a critical distance from his partial and selective interpretation. Indeed, occasionally, evidence provides the faintest glimpse of the truth which lay behind claims to Prechers' origins. Edwards named one Barr, a weaver, among the many notorious sectaries at Aylesbury, who could well be John Barr, a weaver, who is mentioned in title deeds to town lands in 1648. Elsewhere, the weaver, who along with two ploughmen supplied the vicarage of Kensworth in Hertfordshire after the removal of John Siddle, could well be Thomas Hayward, weaver, who shares his name with the leader of the town's Baptists after the Restoration. Another weaver, Lilbourne, interestingly, who apparently preached at Greenstead Church in Colchester until the Restoration, could be Robert Lilbourne, resident of the parish, whose will named a Colchester baymaker as executor. Intriguingly, Lilbourne also bequeathed a great boss, that is, embossed Bible, to his kinswoman, Rachel Sherland. I've only found one other reference to a great boss Bible, which appears in another last will and testament, this time a mock one, printed in 1660 after the execution of Hugh Peter, the notorious independent preacher and regicide. Fortunately, we do not always rely on triangulation of this kind. Among the most notorious characters in Edwards Gangrena is Samuel Oates, an itinerant preacher who baptised his way through the eastern counties of England during the First Civil War. Oates' former employment as a weaver was headlined in Edwards' work and later provided ammunition for opponents of Titus Oates, Samuel's son and the source of the Popish plot revelations in 1678. Oates was labelled a Worston weaver when a bond was taken out for his appearance at the Essex sessions at Easter 1646, and this label followed him around in subsequent legal challenges to his evangelism. Later on, John James, the fifth monarchist preacher who was executed for treason in 1661, was described as a silk ribbon weaver in the reports of his trial and scaffold speech, an occupational label which has been widely accepted. Richard Swift, weaver, was ordered to appear before the Middlesex justices in December 1660 for having usurped the living of John Whiston at Edgware. Sometime Dutch exile James Gedney, weaver and rector of Carlton Road, Norfolk in the 1650s, was almost certainly the same who petitioned Parliament on behalf of Norwich's worsted weavers in the mid-1650s amid their long dispute with local walk-overs. Coming to an end here, but I want to mention that the archival labour of others helps to strengthen connections between the cloth trade and preaching. One Gale, a captain of London's trained bands and both a silk roaster and tub preacher, was accused of ordering his troops to shoot upon apprentices in 1648. This was Peter Gale, who Keith Lindley cites as a prominent independent and preacher in Whitechapel. Stephen Wright's PhD research identified the Baptist minister and controversialist Edward Barber as a cloth drawer. Meanwhile, David Como's excellent recent work has shown how London's separatist communities, including their preachers, recruited from the capital's cloth industry. This includes Stephen Moore, a cloth packer, Edward Rosa, a cloth worker, and Andrew Wykel Wick, a weaver or cloth worker, who, like Samuel Oates, had been radicalised by Thomas Lamb's church. Murray Tolmie has also identified Clement Writer, who evangelised with Lamb in Gloucestershire, as a clothier. But I want to finish this talk with an evangelist who actively identified with his cloth-making past. This was the army chaplain Thomas Moore, formerly a weaver of Wisbech, Norfolk. Responding to Thomas Whitfield's 1646 refutation of his, quote, loose opinions and licentious tenets, Moore admitted that he had been a weaver some 20 years since, but that, quote, he hath no cause to be ashamed of it, unless for his entering it contrary to the counsel of his deceased father, and without consent of his then living friends, and some correction from God on his body. Indeed, Providence served Moore in counteracting claims, Providence moving between the loom and the pulpit, counteracting claims that his progression from weaving to preaching was an unnatural one. Nonetheless, More's pains to push his trade into the distant past suggests once more the efficacy of orthodox and royalist attacks on the humble origins of men like him. So to conclude, these latter cases show that the stereotype of preaching textile worker drew strength from real-life cases. We should not be surprised about this, given evidence of preachers who justified lay evangelism throughout the 1640s and 50s. Not far from the last known location of the preaching lieutenant and silk weaver with whom I began, one Floyd of Aston Rowan, Oxfordshire, apparently taught, quote, that laymen, weavers, tinkers and cobblers being gifted might be preachers. The clothmakers who did turn to evangelism garnered celebrity. In his attack on Thomas More, with whom I concluded, Thomas Whitfield noted that the weaver's teaching had, quote, much raised his reputation by the opinion which some have of his more than ordinary parts and piety. Evidently, there was particular concern among more orthodox ministers that mechanic preachers were an effective vehicle for the seduction of what Whitfield called simple people. That Samuel Oates, Clement Writer, and Andrew White, or Wick, all emissaries from Thomas Lamb's London congregation, travelled to the clothing regions of East Anglia and Gloucestershire, suggests that the clothmakers of England would be attracted to the preaching of others who practised the trade. So too with the clothmakers who were active propagators of the gospel in South Wales. We might speculate that communities of men and women whose common experiences of labour and its precarious economic context transcended ecclesiastical hierarchies and acted as powerful venues for spiritual nourishment. It would be remiss to imply that the evidence presents the cloth trade as the sole origin of mechanic preachers in the 1640s and 50s, but it does account for a significant proportion of such cases. This may reflect the sheer numbers who worked in the industry, something like 1/10 of the adult population in the 18th century. But as dozens of historians have pointed out, there was and had been a singular connection between textile manufacturers, Reformation and Revolution. Indeed, Britain's decades of conflict reflect merely the efflorescence of a longer-term trend, which I do not have time to cover, a trend which was forestalled by the political reaction of the Restoration in 1660 and what Hill termed the experience of defeat. But, as Hill himself pointed out, and as I hope to have shown, the 1640s presented an intoxicating new freedom for England's workers, and we can follow him in continuing to find the era of England's revolution a fruitful period for studies of plebeian empowerment.